The story is told of a Thomas J. O'Connell, lifelong resident of Dublin, who died and found himself standing at the pearly gates. He met there the guardian of the gate and asked if there was a place reserved for him. St. Peter, he said, "I've been a good man. I've loved my wife and my children. I went to church every Sunday, always paid my pledge." "Have you sinned, my boy?" came the response. "Well, St. Peter, I guess I sinned a little, especially when I was young and foolish. I bet on the horses a few times, fibbed twice or two, had few too many drinks, so I guess you could say that I've sinned, if that's what you mean." "Actually, I was thinking of some more egregious sins," the gatekeeper, leafing through the great book of life, said. "Did you do anything more serious?" Thomas J. O'Connell thought for a moment. "Well, I guess the only thing that I can come up with is that one time when we were in school and playing rugby. I played for St. Thomas's and we were playing against St. Anthony's for the national championship, and it came down to the very end of the match. It was all tied up. I had the ball, scored to win the game, but there was some controversy. One referee thought I had fumbled the ball before scoring, and the other one thought I hadn't. They took me aside and asked me to be truthful, to say what had happened. Now, you have to remember, St. Peter, this was for the national championship, so it was kind of in a tough spot. Truth is, I did fumble the ball before scoring, but I couldn't say that and let my teammates down, so I lied and said I didn't fumble, which meant that St. Anthony's lost the championship because of me. I always felt bad, St. Peter, about those St. Anthony boys not getting their rightful trophy. But that can't be such a bad sin to keep me out of heaven, can it be, St. Peter? "Oh, I really don't know," came the brusque reply. "You see, St. Peter's out to lunch and I'm St. Anthony." There are some sins that are just hard to get over, some slights that are hard to forget, some wounds that are hard to heal. If you're human, you know what I'm talking about. If you're human, you know that life is filled with all sorts of injustices, all sorts of jabs and stabs, cheats and double deals, misunderstandings, attention that was not paid, feelings that have been hurt, promises not kept. And we each have this ledger that includes on it a list of IOUs, things we feel that we are owed from previous injustices. He owes me an apology. She owes me an answer. He owes me a telephone call. She owes me an explanation. The course of our lives, I suspect, gets determined to some degree by what we do with these IOUs, what we do with these grievances, what we do with our righteous indignation. Do we, like St. Anthony, take all those IOUs to the grave? Some would say that we don't take our grievances to the grave, that it is our grievances that take us to the grave. You remember that story about Andrew Carnegie and Henry Clay Frick, two of the most successful industrialists of the 19th and 20th centuries. The two men used to be partners, but something happened in their relationship and things soured between the two of them, and they remained estranged for the last half of their lives. But when time finally rolled on and Carnegie grew ill, he penned a note to his old friend, his nemesis, and asked him to meet him for lunch to bury the hatchet. The note was delivered across town, handed to Frick. Frick read the note and then turned to the messenger and said, "Tell Mr. Carnegie I will meet him. I will meet him in hell." Some would say that Frick was already there. Our grievances can take us to the grave. Death works upon us through our unreconciled balances. I knew a man who had been let go from his job for unjust reasons, and he never got over it, held a grudge for the rest of his days. I know a woman whose husband left her for another woman, and she's managed to keep that wound open, and sure enough, it's gotten infected with bitterness, and she cannot get the poison out of her system. Our unreconciled ledgers work death upon us, like Dickens' Miss Havisham in Great Expectations. When she's left at the altar, all the clocks stop, the cake grows stale, the wedding gown becomes a mourning dress, and grievance takes her to the grave. And maybe grievance also takes the world to the grave. Can we not trace back our world issues, our conflict, our pain, to the unresolved, unreconciled balance sheets that people like you and me keep? Nation against nation stems from citizen against citizen, right? Citizen against citizen stems from neighbor against neighbor. Neighbor against neighbor stems from family member against family member. Polarization doesn't start at the top. It, of course, starts at the bottom. It starts with what you and I do with our grievances, our bitterness, our unreconciled balances. Something's got to give. That's what we say when immovable forces collide. Something's got to give. Someone's got to give, which I suppose is what makes this good news that Paul talks about the good news. It's if something's got to give, well, says the apostle, in Christ, God gave. In Christ, God, despite God's grievance, despite our rejection of God, despite our inattention to God, in Christ, God was reconciling to the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them. In Christ, God was making peace. In Christ, God was pulling the world to himself. That in Christ, God was pleased to reconcile to himself all things, Paul says in Colossians, whether on earth or in heaven, by making peace through the blood of his cross. God, you see, when something had to give, it's God who gives. It's God who makes the first move. God doesn't wait for an apology. God doesn't take his bitterness to the grave. God sacrifices God's righteous indignation. God lets go of God's grievance, and God surrenders the entirety of his being to gain peace with his people. In Christ, the infection of bitterness and the sour IOUs come to an end. In Christ, death loses its grip. Death ceases its work. And in Christ, God entrusts to us the message of reconciliation. In Christ, God says, you try it now. You sacrifice yourself for peace with your neighbor. You give up having to be right. You give up having to be the victim. You give up nursing your wounded ego. Jesus entrusts to us this message of reconciliation. Blessed are the peacemakers, he says, for they shall be called the children of God. Our Wednesday night group just got through watching The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and the whole story begins with the land of Narnia, and it's always winter in Narnia and never Christmas. This land is held within the cold, deathly grip of the evil witch, and no one can seem to break free. Something's got to give, and it's Aslan, the great lion, who offers himself as the great sacrifice. There is no redemption but through sacrifice, and when the sacrifice is made, Lewis writes, death begins working backwards. And isn't that the truth? That peace and life go hand in hand. Reconciliation and well-being go hand in hand. Harmony and good music go hand in hand. That when we sacrifice our grievances for forgiveness, that death truly begins to work backwards. Remember the name Izzeldin Abuelaish. He was the Palestinian doctor and father of 8 living in the Gaza Strip. He practiced medicine there, but he practiced also the art of peacemaking between Palestinians and Israelis. He incurred the wrath of his own people by not speaking ill against his Israeli neighbors. And then came the day when the Israeli tank shells tore into his apartment, killing 3 of his daughters and leaving 1 blind and 1 eye. What does a man do when such has been done to his flesh and blood? What Dr. Abuelaish did was write a memoir with the title, I Shall Not Hate, a Gaza's doctor's journey on the road to peace and human dignity. In it, he says, the innocence of those girls must never be spoiled by my revenge. I can keep their memory living only with my good deeds. I shall not hate. And for the past dozen years, the good doctor has been working death backwards. When asked how he thought life should work, Rabbi Edward Cohn said, "I think that the life cycle is all backwards. You should die first, get it out of the way, then live 20 years in an old age home. You get kicked out when you're too young. You get a gold watch. You go to work. You work 40 years until you're young enough to enjoy your retirement. You go to college. You party until you're ready for high school. You go to grade school. You become a little kid. You play. You've got no responsibilities. You become a little baby. You go back into the womb. You spend your last months floating, and you finish up as a gleam in somebody's eye." Is it possible to become more alive the older you grow? Well, the good news, according to Paul, is yes. Death works backward when the reconciling peace of Christ fills the gap, builds the bridge, heals the wound, and sure enough, we then become ourselves the gap fillers, the bridge builders, and the wound healers. John Killinger tells the true story of a 12-year-old boy out in California who tragically was witness to the murder of his two parents. The result of it was that he was put into a state institution for parentless boys, and there he languished. He pulled away and did poorly in school. Though he was brought before a slew of therapists and psychologists, nothing seemed to make any difference. And it wasn't long after graduating from high school that he was invited to a youth group meeting at a nearby church. And over the months of being there, he learned more and more about the life and person of Jesus until the message finally broke through that he had been reconciled to God. Life began to change. The young man began to have purpose. He applied to college, prepared to go to law school. But deep down, he knew there was still something left to do. He had still to do something about the hate. He needed to be forgiven for the hate he had for his parents' killer. And he also knew that to be forgiven for the hate, he had to forgive the one who put the hate there, the one who took his parents away. He had recited the Lord's Prayer enough to remember, "Forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors." So he went to the prison, and his first visit with the target of his hate was very awkward and turned into sort of a disaster. It was just too much for the two men. But he didn't give up, and he went back to the prisoner and said, "I have made a deal with God. I told God that if he would wipe the slate clean for the egregious sin of my hate, I will wipe your slate clean for the egregious sin of the crime against my parents." And that was the breakthrough. That's what got him to the peace. Years later, the young man, now a lawyer, was there when the killer was released on parole, and he helped him to get a job and a new start. Death works backwards. When Cardinal Bernardine of Chicago years ago was falsely accused of sexual misconduct by a confused and angry young man, after months and months of anguish of living under the shadow of this false condemnation, the cardinal learned that the young man who had accused him confessed his sin of false accusation. And so there was no other way for the story to end but with the cardinal inviting the young man to come so that he could say Mass for him. And in his homily said to his accuser that in every family comes hurt and anger and alienation, but we cannot run away from family. We must be reconciled, and we can be reconciled only when we are willing to sacrifice our grievance. No surprise then that 2 months before the cardinal's death, he published his autobiography and called it The Gift of Peace. Lewis Smead said that to forgive someone is to remake them. You think of them not as the person who hurt you, but as the person who needs you. Not as the person who alienated you, but as the person who belongs to you. And is there any truer reality in this weary old world other than that we belong to each other? We belong to each other as God's children. We belong to each other as the citizens of the global village. We belong to each other as Americans. And peace comes only through sacrifice. Peace comes only through letting go of the deadly grievance. Peace comes when death starts working backwards. George Herbert said, "The one who cannot forgive breaks the bridge over which that same one must pass." Something's got to give. In Christ, God gives. In Christ, God was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them, and has entrusted to us the message of reconciliation.